Hello, everyone. This is DJ Sully D, and this is Red Alert Media video number 7. I am ranting and raving on Star Wars. Okay, just to be fair, my rant and rave is going to be more of a discussion. I'm not really a rant and rave type, but you should get the point. Now, I'm going to be honest. I really liked the sequel trilogy. I liked all the trilogies overall pretty well. Things stand out, and there are problems. But for the most part, I've enjoyed what I've seen on the big screen. Solo, Rogue One, I think they've all been fine movies. But I think we need to talk about the fact that this sequel trilogy, which should have had so much potential, we shouldn't be talking about this trilogy as controversial. We shouldn't be looking at the fact that The Last Jedi had such low audience scores. We shouldn't be talking about such a low critic score for Rise of Skywalker. These should have been classic, outstanding movies that anyone would have ranked up there with even the original trilogy. I just want to give you a little analogy. Some of you will get it, some of you won't, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. There is a restaurant down the street that I love to go get their spaghetti and meatballs. The spaghetti and meatballs are great. And, I enjoy eating there. Okay. But I'll tell you, when I go home and I have mom's spaghetti and meatballs, that restaurant's spaghetti and meatballs doesn't look quite as good, and to me doesn't really taste quite as good as I thought they did when I left the restaurant. All right. So to me, one of the problems with Star Wars right now is that there are so many fans out there that feel a certain way about Star Wars. They love the original trilogy. They love the original trilogy, and maybe the prequels have grown on them over the years. They've got a certain way to think about Star Wars. Well, all of those fans are eating mom's spaghetti and meatballs. They're used to mom's spaghetti and meatballs because that represents the best to them. The original trilogy represents the best to them. However, to me, what we're getting is that we're eating the spaghetti and meatballs from the restaurant. So all the spaghetti and meatballs we're eating from the restaurant, they're fine. They're good spaghetti and meatballs, but they're never going to be as good as mom's spaghetti and meatballs. Now, that being said, I am going to mention one other thing before I start, because this is not going to be a podcast about trashing Star Wars because of social justice issues or this stupid forces female stuff that a lot of people have put out there. This isn't going to be that. That being said, first issue with Star Wars that I think needs to be resolved is Kathleen Kennedy has to go. Now, I just put a lot of people who are haters on their feet clapping, but it's not for the reason why most people are complaining now that Kathleen Kennedy's got to go. She's a great producer. She should be doing great things at Lucasfilm. Part of the problem, though, is that she is not Bob Iger's person. Bob Iger did not select her to be head of Lucasfilm. George Lucas hired her to be head of Lucasfilm, and that's a problem. Part of the problem I think Lucasfilm has, or at least the Disney-Lucasfilm relationship has, is because Bob Iger has never really supported Kathleen Kennedy 100% because she is not his person. Alan Horn, the head of Disney Studios, Kevin Feige, the head of Marvel, those are Bob Iger's people. He selected them. Disney selected them. And it's important that when you are the head of a company like that, all your lieutenants are people that you support and probably people that you chose. So, I think if you look at a lot of the rumors that have come out on Rise of Skywalker, I think it looks like Bob Iger and Disney got involved in the storyline. They had things they wanted to see, and it became evident early on that this was going to be a divisive movie, and so they sort of stepped in, and I think the way they stepped in didn't help them out any. All right. And if they shouldn't have had to have stepped in because Kathleen Kennedy should have had that if Bob Iger would have that trust that he would on a normal lieutenant. Again, this is not saying Kathleen Kennedy is not qualified to be the head of Lucasfilm. She most definitely is. Having been a head of Amblin Entertainment, having been an executive producer on all these different hit shows or hit movies, definitely. But, I think at this point, she needs to move on just because of the relationship with Disney. And just to throw this in with Kathleen Kennedy as well is, they've got to hire directors that have experience. I think they really started looking for the new hot director, and then when those directors, something went wrong, when they basically had a movie that busted, or maybe they didn't have a long record of the type of movies they were making. Lucasfilm, hired those directors to do movies, and then it didn't turn out. I think they need to look at experienced directors that really love Star Wars and want to make it great. Second thing I'm going to mention is Disney interference. This sort of goes to the whole idea of what I was just mentioning with Kathleen Kennedy, but also with this idea that Disney has changed Star Wars and they're just writing stories for profit, to get droids and characters to sell for merchandising rights and things like that. And that's something Disney is going to have to take a step back and stop. And I'm hoping that if Kathleen Kennedy leaves Lucasfilm and they were able to put someone they want in, I'm hoping that maybe Disney will sort of give this up and stop and let Lucasfilm do what Lucasfilm needs to do, because they are the experts on Star Wars especially. And along with that, I hope Disney chooses someone who has a Star Wars background. This is probably number 3 for me. This is a little bit of a rant and rave, so, I might go back and forth between a few things, but I'm going to try to keep it organized. And so they need to choose someone who loves Star Wars. I don't mean just like Star Wars. I don't mean a J.J. Abrams who says, how important Star Wars was for him when he was little. He's probably said that about a ton of projects. I believe he really does like Star Wars. But there needs to be someone at the head of Lucasfilm who loves Star Wars, is obsessed by Star Wars, and wants Star Wars to be great. And so, I think that's something that they really have to look at. I hear a lot of this crap about Dave Filoni being the head of Lucasfilm. He's not got one qualification, people, to be a head of a studio, and he's never run a company or business like he would need to run Lucasfilm. If they wanted to make Dave Filoni the creative head of Lucasfilm or something to that effect, I don't think that would necessarily be a real bad idea. I don't know who else basically would be on the short list. I'm not sure about Jon Favreau. He could be a good choice to run Lucasfilm. I'm not sure if he has the business experience to do that or not. But they absolutely have to have someone who has Star Wars in their blood. That's an absolute necessity. And the next thing, I think this is number 4, is they have to sit down and make a plan and stick to the plan. Now, any plan you make can be changed, but you've got to have an overall plan for what's going on. Now, I think Lucasfilm had this to start with. They were going to make the sequel trilogy basically every other year, and then in between those years, they were going to add in one of the Star Wars stories. Well, a lot of things are going to happen, and they're going to make some changes. Of course, The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson doesn't do them a big favor because his trilogy is so different. Rian Johnson basically made it almost look like The Last Jedi was the last of the sequel trilogy. So J.J. Abrams had to completely go back and rethink how things were going to go. And I think that's one of the issues that he had shooting Rise of Skywalker, that and some Disney interference. So they need a plan, they need to be organized, and they need to stick to that plan. Of course, you had Last Jedi, you also had Solo that came in underneath projections. Of course, there was a ton of craziness behind the scenes there with Lord Miller leaving, with Ron Howard coming in. It was sort of bound to be a disaster. It's probably amazing that it ended up making the money it did at the box office. Of course, it likely lost money because of all of the reshoots that were done. But I think Solo we're going to like it a lot more 5 years from now than we did when it came out. And with Solo, with The Last Jedi, I think that shocked Lucasfilm. I think it shocked Kathleen Kennedy and Disney and Bob Iger. And I think they decided, hey, we're going to change the plan. And sometimes that's not a good thing. So now we've got Bob Iger saying things like there's fan fatigue and we don't need Star Wars every year. And you've got pundits saying things like, oh, you've got The Mandalorian, so, let's concentrate more on TV and less on Star Wars movies. And that is a terrible idea, people. Star Wars is movies. Star Wars is the big event movie. That's what we want as fans. Just make sure they're good movies. That's the important thing. Make sure they make sense. At least listen to the fans a little bit. Those are big issues. So plan and organize things out. Things will make much better sense. If they would have had a plan going into this sequel trilogy, if they would have followed that plan, they would have been okay. All right, the next thing is basically changing the Star Wars universe. Now, there's been a lot of changes to the Star Wars universe, and I don't think they are at all positive. Okay, let me say this. When you have a series, a IP that is 40 plus years old, yes, you probably need to make some changes to it. But I don't think you want to make changes to the galaxy. You don't want to make so big of changes that people sort of questioning what's going on. And I think they've made some changes that totally contradict Star Wars canon and Star Wars lore, and I'm not sure that's positive, and I think especially big time fans are not really going for it. I'm just going to throw out a few of those changes that are in there, and I'll ask that everybody sort of gives their ideas, maybe in the comment section below, about changes that Star Wars have made that they're not comfortable with. Okay, some of the changes. Okay, we can jump our ships in hyperspace through energy shields of planets. Okay, bad idea. The second thing is being able to track ships in hyperspace. This goes all the way back to the idea when Han Solo was breaking Luke and Obi-Wan out of Tatooine, basically as they were leaving, and Han tells Luke that they can't be tracked in hyperspace. Changing this really, really changes the Star Wars universe, especially because to me, it makes the Star Wars universe much smaller. All right. The big thing about the whole rebellion and everything was these ships can escape to hyperspace and get away from the Empire. If you can track them now, then, it's over. So I think that was a big time fatal flaw. And basically, along with that also is the change in force powers. I'm really concerned about these change in force powers. I'm someone who, if you can give me a Star Wars movie that has battles, basically like a war movie, space battles, Jedi, and the Force, and lightsaber duels, you're going to get me from the get-go. You're going to have me. But if you get too outlandish with force powers, then we have a problem. And I think we're starting to step over the boundaries of what type of powers you're able to get with the Force. We're starting to get more into magic there than the Force, I think. And I think that is really not a good thing. Jedi, basically, if the Force can expand the powers you have, you're stronger, you're quicker. You can't suddenly project yourself halfway across the galaxy. All right. You can yell someone's name or say someone's name with the Force, and the Force will carry that across the galaxy. The Force is not going to basically project Luke Skywalker halfway across the galaxy to another planet. Okay, last thing that I'm going to complain about today is storytelling, and I think it's something that people don't really understand, and that is the idea that George Lucas has said multiple times that the original Star Wars was for kids, in particular 12-year-olds. Now, there are people out there that when they hear this, they get so angry, and they're adults, and they get angry. When somebody says Star Wars is for 12-year-olds, they just go off the rail. If you do, I don't think you're understanding what George Lucas was really saying. Basically, to me, saying that Star Wars was for kids, was for 12-year-olds, is basically a situation where made up of two things. First of all, keep the storytelling simple, stupid. So keep everything simple. You don't need a lot of convoluted stories. Make sure a 12-year-old can understand what's going on in the movie. And also with the idea of keeping it for kids is you want to make sure when adults go, you're speaking to the inner kid in them. When you go to a Force Awakens, when you go to a Last Jedi, when you go to a Rise of Skywalker, do you have that kid in you that comes back out thinking about these movies? The same kid that you may have been when you watched the prequels and loved those, or the same type of kid that sort of came out when you were watching the original trilogy. Do you have that feeling? All right. And you need to write for that feeling, all right? And I think one of the problems with the sequel trilogy is they were probably a little deep and sort of got away from people feeling like a kid again when they sat down in the movie theater, especially in Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. So, all that's going to be extremely important when you come back to making Star Wars great again. Now, that whole idea of pointing it at kids is also part of the reason why I think we've seen merchandising and especially toy sales be depressed and not very high. Of course, toy sales in general are down big time. Toys R Us is basically, it went out of business. It's apparently coming back, but the merchandise overall is having issues. And I think a lot of that will go back to appealing back to kids and 12-year-olds and, not just putting out some silly little droid that somebody's going to want to buy. You've got to connect to that silly little droid in order to make it a success. So these are the things that I think need to be done to make Star Wars great again. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. Hit that like button and subscribe and let us know what you think. This has been Red Alert Media. We'll see you next time.